Today we're going to begin our look at U.S. History Chapter 1, The Beginnings of America, and we're going to start in Section 1 looking at the world before 1600. We will, of course, look at the Americas, but we will also look at other parts of the world that ended up having an influence on the Americas as well. And so as we start in Section 1 looking at the early Americas, as recently as 10,000 years ago, thick ice sheets covered much of the earth and the sea levels were a lot lower. And during this time, there was a land bridge across what is now known as the Bering Strait. And that's what separates Alaska from Siberia. So, at that point in time, this land bridge was called Beringia. And most scholars believe that the first inhabitants of the Americas were either nomadic herders or nomadic hunters that were following the herds across this land bridge from Asia into the Americas, and that from there some migrated all the way down to the tip of South America. Now, there are some other theories out there, and there's some evidence that some people may have arrived by boat from different islands or even other Asian countries, but most scholars do believe that the first inhabitants most likely came across that land bridge at Beringia. And of course, after arriving, they developed many different cultures here in North America. And so we're now going to begin our look at the empires of Mesoamerica. Empires rose in Mesoamerica in an area that is present-day Mexico and Central America. The Maya began their rise around 400 BC. They built pyramids and developed systems for writing and numbering. In the late 1400s, the Aztecs formed a large empire in what is modern-day Mexico. The environments of North America are very diverse. The Native American groups adapted to the environment in which they lived. For example, the Hohokam people farmed in the desert using irrigation systems. The Anasazi built distinctive dwellings made of adobe. The Adena and Hopewell were known as mound builders because they buried their dead in large earth mounds. Native American groups varied by region. For example, in the Southwest, you had the Pueblo people that lived in many-roomed adobe dwellings. Along the Northwest coast, those groups had an abundant supply of natural resources. California hunter-gatherer groups made use of the diverse plants and animals. Far north groups here lived in the tundra and hunted seal, seabirds, caribou, and beaver, and bear. In the Great Basin and Plateau, those groups were hunter-gatherers. And on the Great Plains, the early plains groups hunted buffalo. Eastern woodlands groups made use of their forest and animals and fish in the region. And the southeast groups settled in farming villages. As far as shared customs and traditions, Native American villages and nations were organized into clans on the basis of kinship. Most Native American groups had a spiritual connection to the natural world. Trade was common between many Native American groups, and barter was the most common method of exchange. Now looking at African cultures before 1500. By 300 AD, several important trading kingdoms had developed in West Africa. Ghana and Mali, the earliest kingdoms, made their fortune from taxing traders. Songhai was larger than Ghana and Mali. Benin and Congo became powerful in the 1400s from trading with European countries. The slave trade started in the 1400s and lasted for over 400 years. It is estimated that as many as 20 million enslaved Africans arrived in the Americas, and of course that's both North and South, from the slave trade. European exploration. In the late Middle Ages, the Renaissance began in Europe. The Renaissance encouraged people to question previously held beliefs and contributed to the Reformation. when Martin Luther and his followers split from the Roman Catholic Church. In response to the changes of this era, the nation-states of Europe began to look for new lands and to gain new resources and find new trade partners. Many countries began to encourage exploration to find these new lands. And this brings us now to Columbus. Christopher Columbus won the support of the Spanish monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, who sponsored his efforts to find a new trade route to India. In August of 1492, he set sail with 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. After 3 weeks at sea, they hit land in the Bahamas. Columbus's voyage paved the way for further European exploration and exploitation, and it also started the Columbian Exchange. Hello. Now we're going to be looking at the European colonies in America. And we start by looking at Juan Ponce de Leon, who claimed Florida for Spain. Hernan Cortez conquered the Aztec Empire. Hernando de Soto discovered the Mississippi River. Francisco Vasquez de Coronado and his men explored much of the southern United States, and they were the first to see the Grand Canyon. Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo sailed north from Mexico and sailed into San Diego and Monterey. While the Spanish conquistadors were exploring the Americas, Spain began to set up colonies in the Americas. They set up several viceroyalties, or provinces ruled by a viceroy, a direct representative of the monarch. The Spanish also employed the encomienda system, where landowners controlled the people in a certain area. Spanish missions. Spain also built a large number of missions in the Americas, especially in Mexico and along the California coast. Led by Fray Junipero Serra, missionaries established more than 20 missions along the California coast. England and Spain go to war. England, France, and the Netherlands began to explore the Americas heavily as well. Under Queen Elizabeth I, with religion becoming an issue between England and Spain, the 2 countries went to war. The English Navy defeated the Spanish Armada. Afterwards, England could establish its own colonies in the Americas. Under King James I, the London Company and the Plymouth Company, both joint stock companies, split North America as they began to build colonies for the profit that they would bring back to investors back home in England. Another one of the famous colonies developed at this time was the colony of Roanoke, which has kind of become known as the Lost Colony of Roanoke. In 1584, a group sent by Sir Walter Raleigh founded the colony of Roanoke along the Atlantic coastline in an area, or named this area, Virginia. The leader of the colony returned to England, and when he returned in 1590, the village was empty. Many theories have surfaced, but nobody knows what became of the lost colony of Roanoke. Of course, there are many possibilities. They could have been killed by Native Americans. They could have died of disease. They could have possibly married into the Native American populations and assimilated. Nobody's exactly certain on what happened to them, and no clear, hard-cut evidence has surfaced to really prove what became of this lost colony. All we know is that they were there, and then they weren't. No remains were ever found that could really prove conclusively what had happened to this lost colony. Another one of the major colonies in this area was Jamestown, and this was the first colony to survive in the Americas. It was founded in 1607. John Smith tried to use military-style discipline with the colonists. John Rolfe learned the proper way to cure tobacco from his wife, a Powhatan woman named Pocahontas. And the relationship between the colonist and the Powhatan Confederacy was often rocky, but Nonetheless, the fact that Pocahontas did show her husband, John Rolfe, how to properly cure tobacco played a vital role in the survival of this colony at Jamestown. The Virginia Company. During the 15 years of its existence, the colony faced numerous hardships, but it continued to grow. Key events in their history included the formation of the House of Burgesses in 1619, which was really the first legislature in the Americas and the first attempt at self-government. They also were responsible for the use of indentured servants, which is where people who agree to work for a specified time in exchange for passage to America. By the late 1600s, they began to participate in the slave trade, using enslaved Africans for slave labor. The northern colonies. After the Reformation, the Puritans wished to purify the church because they thought the Reformation had not gone far enough. Some thought that total separation from the established church was appropriate, and they were known as separatists. One group of separatists, known as the Pilgrims, left England on the Mayflower and founded the Plymouth colony. They signed the Mayflower Compact, a contract agreeing to establish laws, which was one of the first attempts at self-government in the colonies. The Massachusetts Bay Colony. One group of Puritans founded the Massachusetts Bay Company in New England. Their main goal was to make a profit, but some of them sought a religious haven. Their leader, John Winthrop, thought that they should be a model for others. The colony grew quickly and spurred the Great Migration between 1620 and 1643, when over 16,000 English came to settle in New England. Led by Thomas Hooker, a group of settlers who wanted a more democratic government settled along the Connecticut River and wrote a constitution known as the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson, who had been banished from Massachusetts, established a colony in Rhode Island, believing in the separation of church and state. New Hampshire was founded by Anne Hutchinson's brother-in-law in 1638. King Charles I owed money and favors to people, so he granted them with colonies in the middle and southern regions. The English took New Netherland from the Dutch after a brief struggle. Charles awarded it to his brother James, the Duke of York, and they renamed it New York. Later, James gave a large tract of land south of the Hudson River to two proprietors, which became New Jersey. Charles gave charters to 8 men in the Carolinas. North and South Carolina developed very differently, which led to tensions between the two. In 1729, the king divided them into 2 royal colonies. Georgia was established to be a buffer between the other colonies and Spanish-controlled Florida. Charles granted a charter to William Penn, a Quaker. The Quakers believed in personal communication with God, and thus no set worship services were necessary. Penn set out to create a haven for Quakers in 1682. He recognized Native American land rights and made an agreement with the Delaware Indians, which eventually led to a separate colony of Delaware, Maryland. After the Church of England became the official Church of England, Catholics in England sought religious toleration. George Calvert, the first Lord Baltimore, founded the colony of Maryland in 1634 as a haven for English Catholics. The colony was also a source of personal wealth for Lord Baltimore. Hello. Today we're going to be looking at colonial life. Nations began to be guided by the concept of mercantilism, the idea that a nation's power comes from their wealth. To ensure that the colonies remained profitable, they passed the Navigation Acts, a series of laws to restrict colonial trade. Seeking greater control of the colonies, the king merged several colonies into the Dominion of New England. and placed them under Edmund Andros as the royal governor. The colonists arrested Andros and sent him away. While the colonies belonged to England and the British officials were involved in colonial policy, for the most part they did not rule the colonies very strictly. Edmund Burke, a British legislator, termed this practice as salutary neglect, meaning that the colonies benefited from being left alone. The rocky ground in the northern colonies was not good for growing crops. Many northerners practiced subsistence farming, or just growing enough food to feed themselves. Timber, rum, shipbuilding, textiles, ironworks, and many other goods were exported from the northern colonies. The southern colonies developed a plantation economy. Plantations are large single-crop farms. Most farms, however, were small. And this brings us now to slave labor. The southern economy became dependent on slave labor. The triangular trade brought slaves across the Atlantic through the Middle Passage. Between 1700 and 1760, the number of Africans in the Americas increased by more than 10 times to about 325,000. Many Americans were heavily influenced by the Enlightenment thinkers like John Locke and Baron de Montesquieu. Their ideas greatly influenced the American form of government. The Great Awakening was a religious revival led by the Puritan clergyman Jonathan Edwards. The French and Indian War. The 7 Years' War, which was going on in Europe, spilled over into the Americas, where the French joined with some Indian nations to attack England. In the Americas, this was known as the French and Indian War. The colonies were also involved. Eventually, the British besieged Quebec in New France, which is now Canada, and the city fell. The French surrendered the following year in 1760. The Treaty of Paris officially ended the war in 1763. A sense of colonial unity developed. Benjamin Franklin proposed the Albany Plan of Union, which was the first attempt at unifying the colonies, although it was never adopted. France lost the lands east of the Mississippi River, and Spain lost Florida, but gained territory in Louisiana. The war cost England a lot of money, and they felt that the colonists should help to pay for the cost of the war. The war also brought many Native American groups together in Pontiac's rebellion, but in 1766, Pontiac agreed to a peace treaty. To avoid more conflicts with Native Americans, the British issued the Proclamation of 1763, which prohibited the colonists from moving further west. But many did in violation of this treaty.